Today we talk about the widespread flare-ups against African migrants. South Africa is in a scramble for resources and jobs. The economy is stagnating and tensions are rising between locals and migrants. But are these tensions driven by hate, or are they exposing the fragmentation of African unity? Well, we'll find out on today's show. Workers' World starts now.
From England to Poland, every step across the ocean, the ruling classes, them is in a mess. Oh yes, the capitalist system and regrets, but the Soviet system now progress. So which one of them you think is best?
Welcome to the weekly Workers' World Labour Show. I'm your host, Shirik Trubadi. It's indeed a pleasure being with you. Though we're discussing a very challenging topic today, it's going to ask some very serious questions about South Africans and particularly how we relate to our brothers up north. That and more we'll get into our conversation as we start our program today. Now, since 1994, South Africa has experienced xenophobic attacks against African and Asian migrants as well as refugees. In 2008, 2015, 2019, and over the past year, we've seen widespread flare-ups, especially against African migrants who are alleged to be taking jobs from South Africans and the source of crime, such as drug dealing. Most notable victims of these attacks are street vendors plying their trade in the Johannesburg CBD, as well as international truck drivers. In the recent times, political parties have also jumped onto the Afrophobic bandwagon along with Operation Dudula. In today's show, we look at the issue of xenophobic violence from a Labour perspective. But first, let's go to our insert now, prepared for us by the Workers' World Media Productions editorial team.
Since 1994, what I was thinking when the country became infinite democracy, into ezakwenzeka, it's gonna put abantu base South Africa first. But now the borders are open, abantu bayazingenela whatever uhlobo bangena ngalo.
Singabantu bendaweni sisuka Africa sonke. So xa uzobetha umuntu abe ephuma igazi elibomvu elifana nawe, ayonto inhle leyo.
It's just utterly inhumane.
Despite the South African government's claims that it has called and brought the xenophobic violence under control, the lives of thousands of African refugees and migrant workers who were affected have gotten worse.
I think what we see across South African society is a very high degree of mistrust. And that is mistrust against people from different races and also distrust of people who are from outside of the country. This is particularly pronounced when we look at attitudes towards immigrants, but this is something that is shared from the top to bottom of the socioeconomic spectrum. It doesn't explain the violence that we've seen, but it does suggest that there is a high level of kind of social fragmentation within South African society, and immigration is clearly one of the grounds, one of those fault lines under which South African society is split.
First and foremost, we cannot take houses because the houses are issued by the state. You need to have a green barcoded ID.
Everyone is looking you on a way like you come to take their jobs. The Nigerian people, they accuse them for a lot of illegal things.
So politicians are trying to circulate those lies to make them believe if they don't have jobs, it's because foreigners are taking their jobs. If they don't have women with them, because foreigners are taking them. Those are not true. But those are frustrations that are poorly channeled toward other Africans.
When we formed Operation Fiela, it was out of the need that we saw in our township, and where we actually realized that, as you know, it was said that unemployment was sitting at 46.6%. So we then realized that in Alex it's not actually the case, but it's actually more. And where we saw the opportunity was where we actually went to Pan Africa, the area there, which is a business hub of Alex. That's where most of the activities are. And when we did our research, we then discovered that there's a lot of undocumented foreign nationals that have actually occupied the space in which we can actually create employment for ourselves.
As you saw with Donald Trump, as you see in Europe, immigrants are an easy target. Whether it's Mexicans, whether it's Zimbabweans, whether it's people from Syria, whether it's anybody that doesn't look like you and maybe speaks a different language from you, and where the socioeconomic situation is tough for ordinary people. So politicians like to take advantage of that situation for their own purposes, and they want to set poor people against poor people.
They do not respect our laws as well. I mean, not far from us here, it's a gravesite. We then discovered that these people are going there to actually break some of these tombstones that are on the gravesites, making sure that they are destroying even a place of rest of our ancestors.
Very few people, however, are coming to South Africa looking to do crime. There will be some, of course, and they should be punished and arrested and dealt with appropriately. But almost everyone coming to South Africa is looking for a way to improve their lives. The same reason that people will move to Cape Town or Johannesburg or Port Elizabeth.
The majority of the people who are leading this so-called Dudula, I'll say so-called Dudula because I've got a reason to say that. I'm very lucky because in Alex, majority of them, I know them. They are criminal.
One of the factors is the casualization of labor and moving towards cheap employment, and the farmers is seeing opportunity whereby they can exploit these vulnerable migrant workers. They are recruited by labor brokers in the first place, and if you read the statement of the labor brokers, they are accusing farmers who give preference to say to them that they must look for Zimbabwean nationals.
I was once talking to one white man, Prover, and I asked him, why are you employing Zimbabweans only on your farm? He said to me, you know, Sandy, these people are not getting sick.
It's a difficulty for us to organize sometimes migrant workers because we find that migrant workers move from town to town as the seasons occurred. I think there's a fear amongst migrant workers who's undocumented and even those that are documented. There's the possibility of losing the only employment and income that you are currently here for.
President Ramaphosa kuba nama-family meeting asho ukuthi i-xenophobia ayivumeki. Okwesibili kufanele benze sure ukuthi bayabavikela abantu abaphuma ngaphandle uma behlaselwa emini kwabhanga. Okwesithathu akuthunyelwe ama-inspector ezinkampanini ukuze bonke abasebenzi bavikeleke bathole iholo eliphilisayo. Kungabikho umuntu oxhashazwayo ngoba engazalelwa eSouth Africa.
All right, there we've heard it. It's a terrible tragedy that we sit with a problem like this. And it's something that I've been grappling with for some time. Is it xenophobic violence? Is it Afrophobia? Is it self-hate? What is it? Is it an economic system that's driving competition instead of it being amongst businesses? It's amongst the lives of my fellow Zimbabwean neighbor that may or may not be here legally, and that could justify him being burnt alive or being driven out of his home. What is it about this particular challenge that we have that is breaking away the social fabric of Ubuntu? And we're going to get into that now with my guest that I have, Joseph Ilipson Maniragena is from the Human Rights Progress Manager. Sharon Ikambaram is with us as well, including Matthew Parks Kasatu's parliamentary coordinator. I'd like to start off with you, Joseph. Thank you so very much for being with us. Try and answer that question for me. How does one diagnose this particular problem? Xenophobic, Afrophobic violence, what is it?
Thank you so much for having me, and greetings to you and the colleagues in the panel. You are right, Judy, this question is huge, and it's becoming worse. It's becoming from bad to worse because of especially economic and social situation. Mostly, if you try to diagnose it, if from maybe the human rights perspective, it's mostly driven by ignorance. Ignorance because people don't get enough time to get to know each other. People don't have a little opportunities where they interact and they know why people get to leave their countries and come here, what happened to their countries. And then there is also people wanting to take advantage of those situations, especially politicians, some politicians who sometimes instigate other people, especially the unemployed, saying, oh, these are the reasons why you don't have a jobs, and knowing that it's not true. But mostly, I would say ignorance. If people get to know each other, they don't get to have a migrant or immigrant their side. You have local South African. There is little time where they get to know each other, and then mostly also lack of economic opportunities.
I want to break that down, Joseph, but I wanted to just pick up on that with Sharon very quickly. Is it a little love that are needed amongst Africans, getting to know each other, you know, as Joseph says there, Sharon?
No, I don't think so, to be quite frank with you. I think that what we are witnessing is, and it's a lot of what Joseph has summarized, it's institutionalized xenophobia in the way that the state, in particular the Department of Home Affairs and the African police services, the way in which they enforce law and order often is unlawful acts. And why I say that it's not that we are self-hating and that we don't like our Black brothers and sisters from the African continent. It has been fueled. And there are a number of reports. In fact, we were picketing the South African Human Rights Commission yesterday to mark Africa Day, because they have produced reports with incredible findings that point to the very fact that Joseph was making, that it is socioeconomic inequalities and the way in which the state and various departments are attempting to scapegoat migrants and blame them for their failure to enforce and implement policies, and particularly for me, the massive failure to transform this country, which is a constitutional obligation.
Okay, so we don't love each other too much. We're scapegoating, or at least governments are scapegoating the residents. Matthew, how does COSATU see it? Because I mean, it's a complicated issue. It would be silly of anybody to say that, you know, this is the only reason why we see these tensions.
Look, I think I'll take a different point of view. I'll take an economics point of view. We live in a country with an unemployment rate of 46%. The unemployment rate for young people is about 75%. So there's going to be economic tensions. We are the most unequal society in the world. There's huge levels of poverty, especially in townships and so forth. And at the same time, I think we have seen a significant flood of migration to South Africa from neighboring states, from across the continent, from across the world, from as far as Asia and so forth. So yes, when there's an economic crisis and when you see a huge migration flood coming in, it's going to exacerbate tensions. There's a ticking time of unemployment rate of 46%.
Yeah.
And then literally just come a fight to the death that if I see my job is threatened, I'll blame somebody else. So it is going to explode.
I think
it's not sustainable. Many countries have been affected by such situations.
From the break, we continue our conversation about the xenophobic tensions facing South Africa. All right, so we're looking at a series of academic reasons for why we sit with xenophobic tensions in this country, but it turns particularly violent on the ground. And I want to get into unpacking that. Sharon, let me start off with you. The reality that we sit with in terms of, you know, when a shop of a migrant is targeted and it's done in such a violent manner. In recent times, we had, for instance, you know, in parts of Gauteng, an African brother being brought onto the street, burnt alive on suspicion that he may be here legally or illegally. Why is there such a harsh tone to these attitudes that you believe is the result of government scapegoating its residents?
No, I don't think that's the only reason. I think it's opportunism, and I think that it's right what Mr. Park says, that we have a serious systemic problem of unemployment, but we're not going to resolve that problem, if that's what he was trying to imply, by keeping the migrants out, because we know that that crisis of employment is because of the economic policy of this government, and because of things like outsourcing and the privatization, which is seeing the bloodshed of employment. And the kind of work that migrants take up is largely in the informal sector. What we should be doing is actually be championing for better working conditions for all who work in our country. And so I think, and just to answer your question, quite frankly, I do feel that our colonial past, the apartheid past, has wounded people in this country, and particularly Black people. If you look at the migrant labor system and what it did to Black bodies, you look at just slavery and what it's done. So I think that we are wounded, and the problem is that we fought to overthrow apartheid, and almost 30 years into our democracy, if you look at Alexandra, if you look at Soweto, if you look at Deep Sloot in the province that I'm living in, nothing much has changed. And so people are angry, but their anger is being misdirected against migrants, the most vulnerable, while the state is getting away with excessive corruption. And that's where resources are going. I would say that this government and Kusulu should be leading a campaign for wealth tax, for a basic income grant that would alleviate the stress of excessive poverty and would enable people to go and seek employment and find employment. But obviously there should be a clear strategy by the state to create decent work that provides a living wage, and not something where you sell tomatoes on the side of the road and don't know if you'll make enough to get, provide food for your children at the end of the day.
Yeah, Matthew, do you feel that that is sufficient? I mean, it's in the ideal world where we have a state that is most definitely responsive to the economic challenges and would by virtue grow the economy by creating jobs. But the reality is such that we sit with a very complicated, almost a stagnated economy at the very moment, with a scramble for resources that is quite evident. Is there a way to temper this even in the short term?
Yeah, we've got short-term interventions like a presidential promise stimulus, which we hope to see double to create at least 1 million, if not 2 million jobs for young people, help them to get experience. We've been able to convince government as COSATU to extend the 350 SRD grant to continue it. It's providing some relief for about 10 million unemployed people. But those are kind of short-term measures. Those don't address the fundamental crisis of the economy. So we've got to fix ESCOM. So there's reliable and affordable electricity that will help all companies. We've got to save and rebuild Transnet, which is key to jobs in mining and manufacturing, agriculture, and so forth. We've got to rebuild Metro Rail because that's key to transporting about 10 million commuters in our cities to work. And of course, you look at rebuilding the state because the state has really collapsed in the past decade of state capture and corruption. You can see at municipal level, a lack of basic services in many rural towns, causing companies to close, to retrench, and so forth. We've got to look at how to mobilize, how to tackle corruption, and so forth. That's, some of those are short, some of those are medium, some of those are longer term interventions. But I think also we've got to be fair to government. So government can create 5 million jobs. That doesn't resolve all our crises. So we have to also see how to work with Zimbabwe, for example, which is, we all know, experienced a political and economic collapse in the late 90s, early 2000s. And as a consequence, millions of Zimbabweans left, not because they don't want to live in Zimbabwe, but because they left from political persecution or lack of economic opportunities, etc., often very skilled people, to South Africa. We've seen other countries too. So South Africa's government and society can do so much. We need to help rebuild Zimbabwe. We have to work with Mozambique to work together, because you cannot be an island of so-called relative prosperity, for lack of a better term, in a sea of poverty. It's not sustainable. There's no amount of policing that government could ever do to control our borders. If the UN can't get it right, Europe can't get it right, then very unlikely to get it right. Yeah. But also means other countries' governments also got to come to the party. They cannot outsource their failures to South Africa. So Zimbabwe's government has to sort out its problems. They cannot simply say, well, we wish away half of our country to South Africa, it's their problem. Similarly, with other countries, we have huge problems with human trafficking, where people pay traffickers, from Bangladesh, etc., come to Kenya. They bribe customs officials and send people down to South Africa. So there's a coordinated problem which needs to be addressed with other countries. It's a difficult one. I don't know if there's any easy solutions. But having said, at least as South Africa, we need to fix our economy, we need to rebuild our state and see how could we manage this thing. But it is a ticking time bomb, and we've seen violence
But you raise an important point, because if one contextualizes this even internationally, you look at what happens when if a Syrian refugee moves into parts of Europe, how uneasy it makes that nation feel, or at least those nations feel. We see this with Mexicans and Latinos in the United States and the challenges that exist there as well. So I'm beginning to think that we're dealing with a much more universal problem than just calling it Afrophobia, as it were. But Joseph, Matthew, though, does problematize a very serious point that even if prosperity at the level that is satisfactory to this economy were to come, for as long as Zimbabwe and Mozambique struggles, we will inevitably continue to struggle with a migrant issue and tensions between migrants and locals. How do you see the role of neighboring countries in trying to deal with a problem that is symptomatic in South Africa?
Thank you for that question. And I agree somehow that problems facing countries, they are linked. But also let's not forget that some of the politics of South Africa has led to the situation which is in those countries. When we keep on supporting, or because of diplomacy, we don't want to speak truth to power with what is happening, for example, in Zimbabwe. What do we expect? Everyone knows what is happening. For example, just a quick example, in Zimbabwe, human rights is a taboo. It's something which people really don't talk about it. And that's the consequences. And we know South Africa is really a powerful country. If it takes a strong stand, I'm sure things can change. So those are some of the consequences we see here, where in the name of not wanting to upset neighboring countries, where we keep quiet, but we know very well that it's affecting our country. So I will suggest that if really South Africa should stick to its human rights culture and point the right thing where something is wrong, even though here everyone is not holy, but sometimes there is really where it's clearly taking a stand in the wrong direction.
Yeah, Sharon, I'm going to have to go on a break very quickly, but before I go there, you've obviously spoken to certain migrants that were impacted by xenophobic violence. How do they see what's going on at the moment? Sharon?
Yes, sorry, I just forgot to unmute myself. It's a difficult question, because what we are seeing, and especially how the media covers this, is lives being lost. The death of Elvis Ntuli, we see people's homes being demolished, their work being demolished. People are very scared. I work at Lawyers for Human Rights, and we see hundreds of people who are seeking help with their documentation. So, a lot of myths are being spread. Firstly, there is a flood of migrants in our country. We don't have disaggregated data to monitor movement of people, both internally, and I'd like to speak to that, and also international migrants. And that's something that's a serious problem. But people are terrified. They're not coming forward for a vaccine because they're scared of being attacked by Operation Dudula. When people are approaching to assist, they are scared that they're going to be arrested and put into detention. So it's just as much as we as South Africans are struggling with the economic crisis, the fear that we're putting in place in the most vulnerable in our country, people who have fled places like the DRC and Somalia, are afraid for their lives. And I think what Joseph says about our human rights culture leaves much to be desired when we see what we are doing to predominantly our Black African brothers and sisters coming to South Africa. I want to get
into that, once we return, I'll talk about Operation Dudula and the challenges that is beginning to breed over there. So we'll get into that and more once we do return from the break. All right, and I think there's lots of ideological challenges that we sit with. I mean, for those that identify as Pan-Africanists, as socialists, we want to believe we come from, you know, one Africa. Bob Marley used to sing Africa Unite, but we're very much far off from that. And that's a conversation we're having tonight about xenophobic violence and the challenges that we sit with. Sharon, I want to just pick up with you very quickly in terms of, you know, Operation Dudula. It does appear to be by a bandwagon of individuals that have a cause and they appear to be running with their cause. But it doesn't help that in places like Johannesburg here in South Africa, you have politicians like Herman Mashaba and others that are problematizing the issue around movement in and out of South Africa and the occupation of buildings, etc. Essentially problematizing poverty, but in a different light that is almost appeals to the lowest common denominator. I want to talk about why you think Operation Dudula and others are getting the wind at the moment that it appears to be getting.
I think, and there is a lot of reports that have been written about trying to question where does Operation Dudula get its funding. It is a very well funded, even though it's just came on the scene in the last 2 years, and you know, and it floods social media with a clear strategy in the way that the Pinja saga with the Guptas and trying to promote racial hatred in our country. To meet the ends of that state capture agenda. So I think we do need to do more investigation to find out whose vested interest is it to have this country reeling in violence. There's not a spontaneous movement. Wherever they try to build and have a branch, they get less than 100, 150 people. So it's not that this is something that is coming from the communities. It is being imposed and there is an agenda. So I think that it gets fueled by exactly what you are saying when politicians take cheap shots and blame the poorest. It's always the poorest. It's interesting that Mr. Herman Mashaba won't speak about a wealth tax or a basic income grant or question why the CEO of Eskom can earn 7 million. That's his package. When we celebrate that we've got a 350 grant during COVID. So, you know, I really feel that we are not dealing with the real problem of the excessive gap between the rich and the poor in our country, and that gap is getting bigger. The World Bank has produced a report confirming this. And we need to redistribute that wealth. That's the only way we're going to be able to transform this country. And it's unacceptable that continues. So I can imagine that if you're living in Alexandra and see the wealth in Sandton, will that not fuel anger in you when you have to eke out an existence with no water, with no proper electricity, poor service delivery, and there's no resources allocated to address this?
So is that anger is not being directed at the person that lives in the Randburg or Sandton. It's not directed at them. So, and this is part of why I think it's so complicated. It goes and targets, and I'm talking about those that do go and target the migrants. It targets the guy that's running a shop or trying to go and do his job and earn, you know, the same 60 Rand or 80 Rand a day that you would probably earn if you had that job. So why is there the targeting of that African migrant as opposed to those that are the hoarders of the wealth?
I think you pointed it out. It's the, you know, and I've seen, and I've been watching the media, you'll see a coverage of the Zimbabwean who was stealing railway tracks, and his name and the fact that he was undocumented is mentioned in the article. But when there's any other crime committed by a South African, the nationality is very conveniently not mentioned. And I'd like to know, what difference does it make? Crime is crime. It needs to be dealt with. People, law and order is critical in our country, irrespective of the color of skin or your wealth or where you come from. But that's not the thing reported in media. So the media has a responsibility to play in how it covers these issues and what it contributes to the perceptions. And of course, I think a big part that you have spoken to and Joseph has spoken to is political parties are not getting votes, and they're scapegoating migrants because they think, and Action SA got a significant increase as a new party, so they feel if we're going to blame the migrants, we're going to get votes, and 30%.
Very quickly, you know, to look at in the instance where truck drivers were being targeted, and these were truck drivers from our fellow African states. In that instance, what role does the business play in the allocation of who gets the job? And because there's an issue here with whether these are documented or undocumented, what wages are being paid, etc., and whether there's a deliberate effort to skew the employment towards migrants from the continent as opposed to employing locals. What is the chatter among unions at the moment about the manner in which these targeted attacks appear to be happening, particularly amongst the truck drivers?
Yeah. No, look, it's a huge problem, and it's been one of the issues that we've raised as COSATU time and again, and our affiliates have raised it, that employers are really stoking a crisis. At times, employers, like in the trucking industry, in agriculture, restaurants, many other sectors, which traditionally employ quite low-paid jobs, in the fuel industry as well. And they'll often employ undocumented migrant labor deliberately, because they know these are workers who are desperate, they are fleeing poverty-stricken, political crisis-ridden countries, and they'll accept any wage out of desperation. And they exploit these vulnerable workers, or desperate workers, knowing that they can pay one below the minimum wage, so they profit for the company, knowing that they can abuse their rights, like the right overtime to pay time off and all the other rights, and knowing that they won't join unions because they're too afraid to raise a voice, because the employer will just simply dismiss them and say, well, go and take me to CCMA, but I'll report you to Home Affairs and have you deported. So it really is a ticking time bomb. And time again, we have seen violence break out recently, about a month ago in the Western Cape, near Robertson. It is a huge problem. That's why, in an unhelpful way, you see the violence happening between truck drivers. And it really is getting out of control. And employers, to be honest, are making it very difficult in these sectors purely for the sake of profit and abuse workers. But equally, we think also that government departments also are failing to do the job, because the labor laws are clear. You've got a 60% South Africa, 40% migrant worker kind of ratio already there in law. You've got the work permit regime, the critical skills regime, and all of that kind of stuff. But employers are violating it. The Department of Labor is enforcing it. So as a consequence, victims become these desperate migrant workers who are just simply desperate to earn a job and to live in peace. Yeah. And of course, it creates tension with local workers who are also equally desperate for any job. And it really is a ticking time bomb, and employers are not helping manage the situation at all.
And I think it's that desperation that's leaving them quite exposed at the moment. And Joseph, I want to just very quickly hear from you. The requirement for a migrant, first of all, to be legal, to have the requisite paperwork and the working permit that often is branded around. How difficult or easy it is for the migrant to get access to the documentation?
Thank you. Before I respond to that, let me quickly mention something. I think Sharon or Matthew alluded to that when you spoke about Mashaba. Herman Mashaba, he knows what he's doing. And it starts when he was there. And when you keep on saying, people believe you. You can say as an educated politician that every migrant is an illegal migrant. That is the term he keeps on using, and then he have used it during the election. And the people in the street, they don't know to differentiate who's illegal and legal. But the politician, I'm talking about bad politicians, they use this as a way to get votes or failure politician. And people have noticed this, and it's being practiced in other countries. But for example, in DRC, but them, because it's easy to get a group of young people, get guns and start a movement, then later on we negotiate with government and they get a place in a government. But here, at least we still have a strong institution. It's not an easy way to start such a movement. That's why they use people like Operation Dudula.
Very valuable but very quickly, do you think it's easy, it's complicated to get the necessary documentation when a migrant lands in South Africa?
It's practically impossible. And this is I know very well that it's, I've worked with refugees and migrants for almost 10 years. And it seems like the Department of Home Affairs does this knowing what they are doing. To get a proper paper, you found people who have been here 20 years. Can you imagine a family of 20 years in a country with a paper where it says, come back every 6 months? And after every 6 months, they tell you come back. I can give you those examples. So this is a desperate way to keep migrants away from opportunities and make them become illegal. And you will see
the issue that Sharon spoke about, the fact that there are these systemic challenges that is laying the foundation for the type of attitudes that we see towards migrants. So we'll pick up on that and more as we return from the break. Of course, we're talking about xenophobic violence and why it is a particular challenge in South Africa. Right, but now there are systemic challenges that we sit with. We've evidently learned this so far in our discussion. But what about the question that, they come here and take our jobs? They are responsible for drug dealing. They are prostituting women. They are kidnapping us and taking us across the border. What about those questions? Let's get into it in this last segment of our program. Sharon, those are, as perhaps uninformed or misinformed as they may well be, are very real questions that locals ask themselves. Why is it that you have almost Somali towns and Nigeria towns and those sorts of things that are dominating certain markets, that they are an eyesore? This is the sort of language that's being used. Where do you think these questions come from?
Well, I agree with you. I think people who migrate, and I can say my history is my grandfather came as a indentured laborer to this country, and you can see how Indian communities would stick together. It's a protection. I call it what you like, and I think that in particular in our instant, right, what we're talking about now, it is protection. If you think that 2008, the kind of violence we saw, and what the media covers is not what actually happens on a daily basis. And, we are seeing the reality on the ground, the kind of harassment of what is simply because they're a migrant, and if their skin is darker, then you're assumed to be a migrant. And those are all the infringements that are taking place that forces people to live in the way that they do. So there's very little so-called social cohesion in the context of all that we've been talking about with the scapegoating. And I think that's the reason why you have all these tensions in society. While having said that, recently a report came out about the symbiotic relationship of particularly Africans who, many in that family don't have a job, and their only way of keeping their home and feeding their children is from the rent that they're receiving from foreign nationals who are able to go out and either run a shop or do something. But their contribution to the informal economy that is keeping people is, and a lot of research, Sally Pepperdee, others who have spoken about where that is making an impact on addressing poverty, as opposed to the many programs of the government, which I think we're not speaking enough about, that even law enforcement is riddled with the crisis of corruption, of bribes, of soliciting bribes from foreign nationals. The things that Matthew spoke about, law enforcement and ensuring that people are earning a minimum wage, an official takes a bribe and looks the other way. So this, as long as this becomes a lucrative space for government officials to be soliciting bribes and nothing's being done about it, then why will we need to put in place systems where people can get documented, where people are being able to live and we manage movement in a way that respects people's human rights and human dignity?
Yeah, and that particular human rights and dignity that is supposed to be fundamental is so sorely lacking. And I want to put the same question to you, Joseph. The sort of attitudes that rile people up, make them become emotional about this sort of thing. How do migrants see these these almost attitudes towards them that they're either drug dealers, they're taking over, they're taking our jobs, they're prostituting our women, or they're taking them across the border. How do they, when they hear these things, how do they feel about them?
Thank you for that question. Obviously, it's not a good mood to hear that you are being generalized. And we should really say it clearly, even if there may be 1 or 2 immigrants who are committing crime, not all of them. We have good immigrants who are doing a very good job in our hospital, doing a good job in our schools. We've had in Limpopo when they stopped immigrants to teach. Now there's no one to teach mathematics and physics. So it's not everyone. And there are people who are really driving that tendency. If you check like the social media of the South African police in Gauteng, they only say when it's an immigrant who have committed a crime. So if you check, you think it's immigrants who are only committing crime, because when it's another person, a local, they don't say it. So it's a Zimbabwean, someone from Maputo, but if it's a local, they don't say. So it's, but really on the question you asked, it's bad when you are just taken into a blanket. But when it's a good thing, they don't mention the nationalities. So migrants are here really to contribute. And let's say this, we can take different approach. Like some of the European countries have taken, we can benefit from this group of people. They are here to contribute. They are here to build the country of the refuge. And if we can really put those efforts together, you will see how South Africa will benefit greatly.
Yeah, and we don't have much time to talk about what is clearly a difference in work ethic here amongst locals and migrants, which I think is also fundamental to the social cohesiveness that could be established. But I want to quickly, with you, Matthew, understand whether there is a legislative approach that can aid the current scenario. Sure, there's a thing about outsourcing of work and working permits and the type of wages that are paid to the migrants, but I know Parliament at the moment is seized with the National Labour Migration Bill and the Employment Services Amendment Bill. Is legislation sufficient to change around what is endemic attitudes towards migrants?
I mean, look, it can play particular roles. It's not the solution to everything. It has a role to play, but it won't resolve everything. But I also don't think, just another comment you made, I mean, people often say, well, migrant workers will do jobs that locals won't do. You hear that argument in the US and Europe and many other countries. I'm not sure that's a correct argument. I think simply because a local worker wants to be paid a minimum wage, at least, or have his labor or her labor rights respected, there's nothing wrong with that. We should be seeking to improve the conditions of workers. And in fact, in our laws right now, there was an amendment to the Labor Relations Act about 8 years ago, which said that even if a worker is a migrant worker or undocumented migrant worker, they are still entitled to have the labor rights respected like any other South African workers' rights would be respected, like the minimum wage or time off, etc. So look, I mean, there is a proposed amendment, the Employment Services Act, which you refer to, which the minister could be empowered to adjust 60-40 South African migrant labor quota. The minister would be empowered, if depending on the circumstances, to say certain regions or certain professions or certain sectors, he could or she could adjust their labor quota specifically for that sector, or even prohibit migrant labor for that sector. And sure, that can have a certain impact. But equally, we need to also address, as Sharon was saying earlier, the fundamental causes to the economic crisis in South Africa. The unemployment rate of 46% for South Africans or adults in general, 75% for young people. But again, that also it addresses a part of the problem, but we have to develop the region. We have to look at SADC, what do we do to grow the region together? How can we integrate trade relations, etc., across the region? There is one critical opportunity which we need to try to take seriously. It is a difficult one, but it has to be done, is the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. If we can trade among African countries, help create jobs in Africa, so don't just import cheap goods from Asia. That can help create many jobs across the continent. It also means even in South Africa, we have to look at the rural urban migration trends as well, because we are depopulating rural areas. People are flooding to Gauteng, to Durban, to Cape Town in search of jobs, which is their right. But we are putting more pressure on place like Gauteng, which kind of adds more attention to the pot, so to speak. So there's many things we have to do, but of course, law enforcement also plays a role. We have to enforce border management, etc. And again, other countries, not just, and Joseph is right to say South Africa has a historical debt to Lesotho, to Namibia, Mozambique, but we don't have a historical debt to Bangladesh, for example. So other countries also have to play their role and address their own fundamental economic obstacles, because we can't be a silo. We have to work together as a global community if we're really to manage it. And there's nothing wrong with migration, lastly. Migration is part of humanity, it's part of nature, society. It adds to the diversity of countries.
Yeah.
We manage to it.
Thanks very much on that, Matthew. Very important points that you raised there. It's part of the problem that you says it can address. And Sharon, as we wrap up with you very quickly, let's speak to the local. What do you have to say to them if they harbor some of those misplaced feelings?
Sorry. I would go back to the strategies we used in our struggle against apartheid. We need conscientization. We need to mobilize at a community level. And I think the trade union movements have a much greater role to play in unionizing migrant workers. And if there's we know on the darkest days of apartheid, workers joined trade unions, even though they knew they would pay with their life with the kind of repression. So why aren't the trade union movements organizing in the informal sector and fighting for better working conditions and better investment from the government for people to work and workers integral to dignity? So I would say on the question of movement that we are not understanding the impact of the climate crisis that is forcing people to move. Not the big events like happening in KZN or in Mozambique, but what's happening even in sub-Saharan Africa. It's well researched that we are suffering some of the worst consequences of climate crisis, and that is impacting on movement of people. They can't survive on the land. Even Zimbabwe, with its political and economic problems, is also suffering from the impact of the climate crisis, and we have to deal with it as a region and as a continent. And we're not doing that. And I think for me, some solutions to movement would be to have a SADC visa where people can get it. It's accessible. It's not expensive like a Zimbabwean passport. That you can have your biometric, so that would deal with all the issues of undocumented people. And
I think that's a very progressive step forward, the SADC visa, but also this is some of the attitude problem that you have, and even the broader problem around climate change, as you highlight there, Sharon, as well as, of course, Joseph and Matthew having joined us for this conversation. Thank you so very much. Evidently, it's a multi-layered problem that we sit with, and it's anything from economics to attitudes, to work attitudes, to even climate change. And so it gives us a perspective about the work that we need to do on this particular front. Thank you so very much for having joined us. And on that note, we conclude our program for today. This was Workers World Media Productions, looking at the issue of xenophobic violence.